What if burnout wasn't a problem to fix, but a signal guiding you toward deeper alignment with life? The Practice Podcast invites you to explore how aligning with your energy can transform your connection to yourself, your relationships, and your work. Through real stories, data-driven insights, and life-centered tools, each episode helps you tune into your body's signals and create life-affirming change from the inside out. Welcome to the Practice Podcast. Welcome to the Practice Podcast. In this episode of Practicing With, I sit down with Dr. Dale Whelehan, behavioral scientist and CEO of 4 Day Week Global. Together, we explore how true behavior change comes from a shift in identity, why work cultures must be designed for emergence, complexity, and belonging, and the vital difference between doing and being when it comes to sustainable high performance. Dale also shares his experience inside our 30-day journey, where he discovered firsthand how energetic literacy can reshape the way we live and work. Welcome, Dale. It is a pleasure to have you here. This is probably our second opportunity to have a deeper discussion, although we've now known each other, I would say, for 2 months. But it's been a rich connection. It's been a connection that for Christy and myself has felt very, very resonant. You are working on a trajectory of discovery that we are on as well, except for you're taking a very academic perspective and behavioral science perspective on the pursuit of regenerating human energy, unlocking productivity and performance, especially in regards to the workplace. So where would you like to begin? I think I would like to expose people a little bit more to your background as it comes from your mouth. If you could just kind of take us back to how you get to where you are today.
Yeah, well, look, thank you so much for having me on. I completely agree. I think it's amazing how human connection. This has been a really nice experience for me in understanding that it's not necessarily the quantity of time in which you engage with someone, it's the quality of that time and how quickly you can go into deep, meaningful conversation with people. And I've found that from the get-go when Christy and I first had a conversation and subsequently with you, Jess. Really interested in this space. It's come really from a journey, I suppose, of self-discovery and self-exploration. And as you say, married with my own academic background, which is in the space of fatigue and burnout. I suppose when it all started for me was I originally trained in physical therapy, as you call it, or physiotherapy, as we call it here in Europe. And was very much trained in understanding the human body, understanding the physiology, the anatomy, the neuroanatomy, and then found myself practicing within a system that often didn't necessarily necessitate the optimal performance of the human body or the human condition. And I think that's because we operate very much in a curative model of medicine now. And we know why that exists. People are getting sicker. There's not enough resources. The system's under strain. And I became very curious about how might we stop pulling the bodies out of the stream downstream and start thinking a little bit more upstream around why they're jumping in the first place. And I knew physiotherapy wasn't going to be the space in which I was going to answer that question. And so I went into an academic career pretty soon after qualifying and doing some practice. And I did my PhD looking at sleep deprivation in surgeons. And again, started that place where a lot of the assumptions that we make around work is that, it's the on-call model. That's why surgeons are so sleep deprived. They are doing 24-hour shifts. And yes, naturally, one would be feeling pretty tired after working that period of time. But also there is these systemic issues all the way from the individual, all the way up to the culture. So when you even look at something like surgery in the US, the idea of the residency program comes from a guy called William Halsted, who was a really brilliant surgeon who, came up with the mastectomy, really way ahead of his time. And he came up with the training curriculum for surgeons, which was to reside in the hospital. So bring your pajamas and stay on site. And subsequently, on post-mortem, they found that he was addicted to cocaine. And so the entire model of the expectations of performance of some of our, elite performers.
No way.
Yeah, so it's based on this assumption that actually you can't do this without some form of stimulant. And so I became very curious in understanding what is the thresholds of limitations of human performance, and how much are we masking that threshold, whether it be through stimulant use or whether it be through issues of equity, where, the male surgeon has always been able to perform well, but the female surgeon's more fatigued because she had to go home and still do the second shift of labour, which her male colleague never had to do. So she never had the same rest and recovery baked into her work that her male peers had. So it's an explosion, I suppose, into a whole new world and way of thinking, which only became more refined when I went into leading a startup called 4 Day Week Global, which was really posing the question to the world, what if we worked less? That made a lot of people angry. It made a lot of people excited. And most importantly, I think it made a lot of people curious, because it allowed deep conversations around not just how might we make it work within workplaces, like what would that organizational change look like, but also what would be the ripple effects on people's health and well-being, on communities, on the economy, on sustainability and the environment, on issues of equity. And I became really fascinated. And I think since then, my mind exists in this constant flux between understanding the relationship of the individual in the context of the system in which they're operating. And the area of regeneration is a place that has brought me naturally to this conclusion, albeit still a starting point in a new journey for me, where I recognize that the world right now is, we live in an addicted society, whatever that addiction is, whether it's addiction to growth or addiction to substance or to social media or whatever it is. And as a result, we have become unwell in that context. And so the degeneration that we are experiencing and the degeneration we're seeing in economy and society is a model that we can see is starting to fray. And a regenerative model from the individual all the way up to society is something I find as a hugely curious thought experiment. And that is where I'm beginning to delve deeper into now.
So good, Dale. You just summarized so much so succinctly, that I feel as well. This idea that we got to get off the drip. Like, society has got to get sober. Like, this is something that we really have to look at, because we are addicted to stimulus, and that addiction to stimulus has fried our nervous systems, and that is robbing us from our full potential. But when we look at how do you keep up with the demands of the system without the stimulus, or without, honestly, and we'll go into kind of the soul level as well in this discussion, but like, there are so many misunderstandings that we have taken on due to conditioning that also drive the overexertion, like how you can achieve your way out of pain. Like, if I achieve enough, I won't experience pain. And I know that that's how our North American culture is very much wired. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
I can win my way out. And that is an interesting setup that we really have to hold space for. So I love how you are exploring. And I also love that even in how you said it, there is a bit of unknown. You aren't coming in with certainty. You're just on the journey of discovery, which is also a radical position, I think, to take publicly, because people want certainty. They want answers. So what I would like to explore is, like, what are the truths? What are the certainties that we know maybe about performance and productivity? And then what are we holding curiosity around? What do we not know, but we are wanting to know? Can you kind of parse through that a little bit?
Well, I think you've touched on something that, again, I think even early on in my academic career, like as a scientist, you're taught to follow the rule of logic and order and rational thinking. And, the scientific method is built on that deductive reasoning process. You start with a hypothesis, and then you have your null and your alternative hypothesis, and you simply try to do experiments to figure out which is true and which is false. And I think science now has become nearly a catch-all for understanding the knowing in the world, and that the knowing is the only important thing. Dare I say it, I'm getting frustrated with science, because I think it has become, and because of content creation and all these sort of things, it has been taken out of context oftentimes. You'll always notice an academic at the end of their paper will always say further research needed, or this indicates this may be related to this. Academics will never would say with certainty, but naturally academic research has to have some contextualization into the world, and so people do apply it as a certainty. And that's just the world order in which we live in, and that's fine. It has its benefits and its backfalls, but I feel like that this language of certainty has now shut us off from being able to access deeper parts of ourselves. And I think what I'm trying to find is language that can hold a both and space, as opposed to an either or. So what I know to be true, based off that very fundamental training in the health sciences, is that the body does tell us. The body does tell us signals, whether they be physiological or biological. And if we're getting really good at it, psychological, we can really be well aware of when the signals of fatigue or anxiety, and we can have really good emotional granularity and understand when we feel happy or sad or angry or all these sort of things. But they're not obviously not a naturally intuitive signal in a society, as you say, that is constantly overstimulated. So that is the challenge for people: is how do you create the space to be able to hear what your mind and your body is saying. And if you can't track it, tracking allows you some signal, but also you need an embodied sense and understanding of when things are not going too well for you. So I know that's really where we are, but I think the uncertainty very much exists in the space where maybe so much of LinkedIn narrative right now is calling certainty, so that hybrid working is ending, or AI is going to change the world, or it's going to make the world a better place, or it's going to make a world a bad place, and all this debate, which is dangerous, I think, because it's putting people in this polarizing state, and it's not holding that space in the middle for complexity and nuance and uncertainty. And I think that means people are losing critical thinking around some of the biggest systemic forces that are actually making them feel these internal signals in the first place.
You're teeing up the practice 30-day experience. So I feel like I have to talk about it, because I feel like that's what we are doing in the practice, which is giving people a framework that is both objective and subjective, by which they can keep up with their own information. Because I too, after many years of just personal pursuits and my own learning, that my body was like, it was this tuning fork, almost like a metal detector. And I could play with thought, I could play with action, and it would create a certain tone within the vehicle here. And I just started to play with it, and I understand. I'm, a practicing yogi of 26 years. So I spend an incredible amount of time in my internal space, sensing into, different flavors and textures. I know that I have a disproportionate amount of hours clocked in that way. And yet I'm asking, people in a corporate setting that are working 80-hour weeks to develop this skill, like that's never going to happen. So the practice was born from that acknowledgement of how do you give individuals access to their own information in a way that is very accessible and doesn't require them to go sit under a banyan tree to become enlightened for the next 40 years. And not to toot our own horn, but I feel like we have given people bumper lanes, because what we're doing is we want to be mindful of thresholds. When you were talking, I was like, oh yeah, it's thresholds that we want to become mindful of. And you participated in the practice 30-day experience. And so based on your own organic, emergent curiosity and background, how did the practice reflect what it was that you were, or that was organically happening in your own exploration?
Yeah. Let me think about that. I think for me, the biggest challenge during that was that I am prone to intellectualization of these curiosities, and I do a hell of a good job of being able to over intellectualize them and then tell myself I'm okay. And yet I can very much feel somatically that I haven't understood it, and it's not gone beyond here into the rest of the nervous system. And I think what I found really, I think with the mechanism in the context of the 30-day trial that felt the most useful to me, and probably most useful to, I would say, men in particular, I don't know, but it's certainly a common thing I observe across men, is the inability to actually be vulnerable in this sort of space of talking, that to talk about feeling fatigued or exhausted, or to, the emotion or the physical signals that you're doing on the day-to-day basis are telling you that today is a day that you need to take it a bit slower. That's quite a powerful enablement, I would say, and a high level of psychological safety that was built quite early on in that trial with that small cohort of very highly committed people, which felt very different to a lot of similar experiences that I've done over the last few years working in this space of well-being. And so I think for other people, it might be actually the fundamental knowledge of understanding the objective markers and how that relates to subjectivity, but that's something I kind of know already. But it was very much for me the contained space of talking about these things and to put language on it and an architecture around it that allows that shared conversation to emerge, as you said. And I think that's what is critical to it. It is an emerging feeling that starts to happen based off every week, and you get very curious about going outside of the self, which again I think can be sometimes a very male problem, is the egocentricity of oneself, and perpetuated by a society that says self-help is the only way to help oneself. The relationality that's created within that 30-day experience takes you out of your head and puts you in a nearly shared cognitive space, whereby you come away from it feeling not necessarily like anything has been resolved, but actually that something has been seen in a way that oftentimes when people share these experiences, they are offered a solution, a quick solution, and the nervous system doesn't respond to the closing of such a vulnerable state prematurely.
Well said. What do you think the nervous system is looking for? If it isn't looking for a solution, what do you think the nervous system is looking for?
It's probably going back to tribalism, I would imagine, if I were to think back anthropologically around the fact that people didn't share these emotions by themselves for a long part of society. And so therefore, we have, in more recent years, as we've become more isolated or more self-centered, we are now building up these emotional experiences and probably the intensity of them. And because we are evolved in our cognitive states, we're also over-intellectualizing them, which is creating this ruminative state. So therefore, there probably isn't this sort of, like, as I said, contained space of a group of people who trust you and understand you, in which you can allow the expression of such thoughts and feelings without fear of retribution. And I would imagine, because this space is mirroring something very tribal and very fundamentally human, that's what the nervous system is responding to.
Belonging.
Yes.
It's belonging. This is what it is.
Yeah.
And this is what we're trying to also introduce into corporate cultures, is the sense of, listen, the tribe is not going to separate itself from you because you feel tired. There's such a deep, deep, deep fear that one will be kicked out if they can't produce. This is a core wound. So when you're relating your experience, I hear it's the belonging that matters. It's that I can have varied internal experiences, be transparent about that without fear that there will be separation and I won't be a part of the tribe. And that is what I observe happening. That is the core wound of culture. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, you sparked something in me there, which I think is speaking to a broader workplace culture. As you say, like, people don't feel like they can express that sort of vulnerability within the workplace because there is legitimate reasons whereby people will have disclosed that they're not well or that they're not being able to perform because of X, Y, and Z, and they have been pushed out of organizations as a result of that. There has been a real failure of leadership, and leaders do not view burnout as an organizational issue. They still place that disproportionate responsibility on the individual. When we know all of the research out there, since dating back to, Christina Maslach, who curiously was in a relationship with the guy who set up the Stanford prison experiment and made him stop the experiment, which is just some academic nerdism. But like, she's been talking about this for decades. And it's emotional exhaustion, it's cynicism towards one's workplace, and it's a sense of depersonalization from one's work. And that's because the system is not congruent with the fundamental needs of humans. And there is a tension that will exist naturally between the needs of an organization and the needs of a people. But leadership should be acting to make that tension somewhat tolerable. And oftentimes I don't think they are. They're simply making the tension fairly strong. So I think what's useful about the practice is that it actually takes away some of that stigma, because it starts at a very fundamental level of just looking at the human signals within people and starting curious conversations around that. And I think that's probably your in for a way to say, my body's telling me recover today, let's have a conversation why that might be. And that opens up the dialogue as to whether there's something work related or something personal outside of work related, or both, which is probably a better answer. And that's probably the way in which we can begin to start challenging issues of burnout and toxic leadership culture, is through using objective signals of data from the body of your workforce, and then having more deep, nuanced, unanswered conversations around how we might make it a collective better team signal as such.
Yeah, because when we get into performance, I think this was the relief for me. My background early was athletics. I wanted to be, the best at my sport, which was distance running, which is something that we have in common. I was willing to do whatever it took. And what I didn't realize is that my willpower was kind of hiding my body's signals. I would use my willpower to override my body's signals, because that was what was reflected to me as necessary to win, is that you had to be strong of mind. Mind over matter was the thing. And that's true until it's not true. So when I came upon HRV as a objective readiness assessment, how ready am I to actually handle challenge and demand, it's almost like I got to put my willpower into the passenger seat instead of like it driving the car and me off the cliff. I got to use something. It took the guesswork out. It made me feel safe to understand, this is what my body is ready for, and it had all this research around it as a performance tool. So talk to me about now how you relate to HRV as both an athlete and then as a, let's just call it a corporate athlete. And what do you think, or how has it helped or hurt your ability to unlock your systemic potential?
Yeah, I think so I think sometimes the tendency with any wearable, and you see, I used to have an Aura ring quite a few years back as well, and in any change of behavior, I think we go through 3 different phases. We go through this sort of reward phase when we're using a wearable device and it's telling us, you got, a score of this today, and that's very good, and tomorrow you did better or worse. And we actually start to associate our emotional state relative to what those numbers are telling us, and I see it happen all the time. People start using an Apple Watch for the first time, or a ring, or, a HRV tracker. They start placing a lot of blame on oneself, and then also a lot of reward on oneself when things are going up and down on a numerical value. And I think that gets a person to a point. I think when we are trying to create even better behavior change, we become more curious at a second phase around process. So what are those different variables? And I think you mentioned it earlier on, like what are the little small changes that I make in my day or in how I approach things in my mindset that could actually slightly change up and down those sort of metrics. And that in and of itself, understanding that process and that curiosity motivates oneself to engage in a more sustained level of behavior change. But still, long term, what sustains behavior change is a change in identity. To apply this in the context of running. When I started running properly, I was very interested in running 5K, and then I was very interested in running 6K, and then half marathon, and then marathon. More curiously, then as I got more into my running career, I became more interested. But if I sleep well the night before, if I have good nutrition, if I'm not as stressed from my work week, how might that impact on my performance and how much I can run, etc. And now I just simply identify as a healthy person, and running is nearly an automatic behavior for me. So on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays and Sundays, I just get up and run, and I don't think about it, and I don't actually think about how far I'm running or how fast I'm doing it or how slow I'm doing it. I've nearly relinquished myself of all of the curiosity and the anxiety often which goes hand in hand with it. So I think something similar can be applied to how one approaches their work. I think for me, the HRV is a good signal to tell me when things are going awry for me, but I don't allow myself to become overly fixated on it. I kind of know myself, and I've gone through this journey several times over and been humbled every time thinking I've solved it. Another crisis lands at my door. And so I find it just a good way for me to maybe keep myself on track, even though I might not always want to see what it's telling me. And that is having that, underbelly there all the time, I think is critical to stopping myself from going to the point of collapse, which I have hit several times over by ignoring the subjective signals and maybe not having the objective signals there in hand as well.
Yeah, to me, I relate to it as HRV keeps me honest. Just keeps me honest. And but then there's so many nuances of exploration underneath the actual objective signal. Then we get to go into, well, why? How much time? Because you just said I really don't think too hard about the details on the more, I would say, traditional side of like how to be a great runner. But let's go into the fact that humans are multidimensional. And there are multiple things. I think why I love HRV so much is because it's looking at the multidimensionality and it's condensing it into a single data point. So it's looking at your spirit, your physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, relational aspects of self. And it's distilling it down to say, okay, that's how all these dimensions have imprinted upon the nervous system. This is where we're at today. And it can be such a cool point of entry for deeper reflection. I think a lot of times when people are beginning this pursuit of understanding their energy, it is more secure to start with the physical. It's what we know. We can touch it. We can feel it. We can place it. But then there are these more subtle dimensions. So I want to also talk to you about those subtle dimensions and how you relate to that as an academic, because you and I have also had some rich conversation around kind of what is the role of the soul in all of this when it comes to regenerating human energy.
Yeah.
So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, look, I'm still very early in this phase of exploration for myself. So what I think I'm observing really, I think as an academic, like the way I was taught as a behavioral scientist, to think, as you said, the physical, the mental, and the emotional. So like the cognition and then the emotion faculties, and to separate them out, the thinking and the feeling. And I think for many years, I was very good at thinking. I had very little feeling and went years without accessing any sort of internal world within myself. And through various therapeutic interventions, I did CBT, which obviously helps link oneself to thought and feeling and behavior. But I still knew that there was something very undiscovered in me. And I knew I had to go places which I was going to make me really uncomfortable. And I did what was called schema therapy at the time, which was a lot about talking to the young, vulnerable child, creating the healthy adult mode of yourself, changing narratives and identities and beliefs that you internalize so deeply that often they are so unconscious. So I've done quite a good bit of delving into the unconscious as much as my unconscious has allowed me to do. And I think I noticed that as a way. I noticed, having gone through that experience, it did like unshackle something else that was really tight in the body. And I think the nervous system responded really well to that, because I just felt lighter. And you hear that constantly when people, share something that's very deep, very personal, that they've never told anyone before. They feel really, relieved through that process. So I think that was probably my first entry into something a little bit more nuanced, and something that maybe is harder to capture or quantify. I think increasingly this idea of the soul is something that intrigues me, because traditionally I've found it as a language and as a space that I have not been able to resonate with very well. I'm not a yogi, so like that is, but I put soul and spirit and all those sort of things traditionally in that space, and that's for people who do go on retreats up into mountains, which is not me. So, but I still knew there was value in it. Yet.
Yeah, it's not you yet.
I am susceptible to that. If anyone wants to send me on a paid retreat, I won't say no. But I've increasingly, I think what I'm trying to find is language actually that could describe a way in which I can access that space. And so I've been landing with kind of science of the soul or architecture of the soul, because I do think there is a lacking of it in society right now, particularly in the context of Ireland. We were a very religious country for many, many years. There has been essentially a complete erosion of religion within our society, and nothing really to replace it except for work. People have now they've given them their entire selves to the golden calf of capitalism. People are weary, I think, because of that. So for me, the soul is actually about getting back to what it fundamentally means to be a good living human. And they're deeper questions, which I think you will find in older literature. And, I'm reading a lot of the philosophy of absurdism right now. So much of it feels resonant, with where we are today, and yet so much of it has not translated into the philosophy of today's society. So yeah, I'm curious about it, but still have a lot to learn.
No, don't we all? Yeah, there is an exploration of like, okay, when you start to get into the inner work, for you, CBT, for others, it could be talk therapy, and you start to, oh yeah, there are these like fundamental misunderstandings, negativity, limiting beliefs. So you take a swath of time and you address those. And those layers start to lift, because a lot of times people, when we talk about identity, they can start to think that they are their misunderstanding. And that's just the ego kind of getting wrapped in. But you're not your misunderstanding, and you're not your limit, and you're not, the negativity. So do the work to lift those layers. Then what's there? When that part is relieved, then what's there? And then you start to like sit with essence and your nature. And there is more trust in the body because you've addressed the misunderstandings. You've kind of opened up those valves. And so everything is like flowing, and you can trust your system a lot more too, to perceive. And then you're in this whole nother world of relationality, of like again, that tuning fork. And I want to kind of move us into a conversation around understanding your nature and designing business according to nature as the true pathway beyond the problem of the human energy crisis. Because when we started to really sit with the problem of burnout in earnest, and you want to get upstream on this issue, this is ultimately a design issue. But just like the micro individual in these organizations, we have to start to peel back the layers of the misunderstandings, the negativity, the limiting beliefs. But you're doing it with this organism called your organization. And that work, you cannot get around that work. It will have to be done in order for people to feel safe so that life force potential can be unlocked and potential can be actualized. So it is just it's a giant mission because doing it yourself, the amount of commitment, dedication, devotion that it takes in order to get through some of those tight spots. And at an organizational level, it's a whole nother bag of beans to enroll people. Yeah. So yeah. What do you have to say on all that?
God, yeah, it's pretty straightforward, really, isn't it? Look, I wouldn't be an Irishman if I didn't bring up the cynical nature that I have towards all this.
Yeah.
So I don't think we can fundamentally address questions of human energy and the crisis of burnout without talking about human suffering, and I think that's in the context of what's happening in the world and how the brain is observing everything what's happening in the world and seeing so many contradictions between what should be and what is. But that is everything that's happening in the world is also happening nearly in a petri dish version within organizations. And I think we need to talk about sometimes the pain that is work. And I've been surrounded by psychoanalysts over the last 7 to 8 months. So I've learned a new form of language, which I think is terrifying for organizations. And I can totally see why it is. It's not a space, because psychological safety doesn't exist within workforces normally. To talk about human pain and suffering in the context of work is not, probably not going to end very well. But I think there is sometimes a window shopping wellness energy that has taken over organizational culture. That if we just do X, Y, and Z, everyone's going to be happy and well. And it is just not that straightforward. I wish it were. There are so many fundamental hygiene factors when it comes to salary, pay, the versions of ourselves which show up in leadership and the impact that has on the people around us. And, as you said, how evolved some people are in their thinking around some of these things. So some people are operating at CEO level with, some very toxic, self-hating styles of leadership. And of course, as an individual within that context, you are going to feel the impact of that very, very much so. So I think if we want to talk about burnout, we do need to be able to get to a space of where we can talk about how painful work can be. And I don't mean that in like a tokenistic way, but genuine. Like, it is not normal. The way we are working right now is not normal. I think we see that the data is showing us, the body signals are showing us we are living incongruently with how we were supposed to be. And it is only going one way for us.
We're living against our nature, and we have been for a while, ever since the mechanistic age or industrial age. We've been living against our nature, and it is time that we have to return to our nature, because the fallout is just so tremendous. Pain is the greatest teacher. I bow to pain. It's highly intelligent, and it's crazy how much pain people need to be in order to be like, okay, I'm ready to change. Yeah. And these organizations, as long as they are making, money, it's kind of like, again, being on the drip, and they're not getting sober about what has to happen in order for us to really solve the problem. So, give me your perspective on the markets, like honest. You can even bring your cynical side. What do you think is the market's receptivity level to the change that's necessary to solve the problem?
That's a good question. I would say that we're surrounded by so much noise right now that I think the market doesn't really know what the hell it wants. I think there's so much flux happening, and I think there's a real hesitancy, isn't there, for people to invest time or energy into anything because they don't feel like anything is real or legitimate anymore. I think that's a really unfortunate consequence of, globalization and modernization and, evolution of human potential. So I think we will, similar to how we ended up with, say, the 5-day work week, we could end up in a similar space with a different version of work. So the 5-day work week obviously happened due to multiple different shifts happening from government and from unions, and then also, entrepreneurs like Henry Ford and stuff. But one of the other main reasons why it happened was the birth of the discipline of management, which started to systematically look at labor in the context of units of quantified and understanding the relationship between error and performance. And what they were naturally finding was that when people were on these service lines in big factories and they were doing their 6 days a week, that errors were happening and it was bad for production. And so naturally they arose at a place to say, okay, we need to figure out how do we stop errors. And one way we did that was to reduce working hours. And I think we are now going to see something happen similarly over the next while in the context of the cognitive workforce, because AI has not lived up to its potential. And I think it's quite fascinating how quickly the excitement was it and how quickly it has become, a drop in the ocean of a bigger world change. Still, I think people are going to find that we are going to produce so much content with AI and realizing it's not really leading to any return on investment.
Right.
And we're going to need to have a fundamental rethink around why is this not working. And I think we will eventually land at the space to say, okay, these tools are only as good as the people that can use them, and burned out people can't innovate. And that is the fundamental equation. So if we can solve the burnout crisis, we will fully access the potential of innovation and the use of these technologies to create new economies of work, whatever it may be.
Yep. I think I have tremendous relief in knowing that performance principles align with regenerative business. And that's why we are putting our stake in the ground at Source as being a regenerative business. We do not monitor people's hours. We're small, but we trust people to get their work done. If they need help, there's safety that they can ask. And there is a lot of transparency from the leaders down. And that will then telegraph that it's okay to be revealed to us as well. And then the connective tissue that exists between everybody here feels healthy. And it is a little bit more of a family feel. But yeah, reestablishing a way of leading that creates conditions conducive for life to happen. That's the hallmark of regenerative. So,
but you touched on something actually, which I think is critical to the enablement of this, and that is the arbitrary use of time as a metric of productivity. Because,
let's talk about it.
Because I suppose, the 9 to 5, 40-hour work week came in when people were simply producing widgets on service lines. So actually you just kept on producing as much as you possibly could in a quantified amount of time, and that was considered being productive. The knowledge economy is non-linear, so we don't produce in that sort of sequential way. We need periods of space away from the work in order to access a part of the brain called the default mode network, which allows the lateral thinking and ultimately the synergy between two previously disparate ideas that might have been happening unconsciously within the brain. And that's where the innovation happens. It's not, it's not just random that some of the greatest thinkers in the world took long walks or naps during the middle of the day. Like they recognize the importance of that rest and recovery as a critical enablement of better thinking and better insight. And we exist in that space and work right now is how do we create better thinking and better insight? And we are not evaluating performance or productivity based off that very fundamental scientific principle. So until we move to a model that is more outcome based or output based, and we don't put such rigid parameters around how the final output will emerge, then we are doomed to this space of producing more and more and more and yet not creating anything of value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so important. And I think you do a tremendous job at giving us kind of the historical origination of like how this even came to be, because so much of it is just terribly, terribly outdated. And so we just need, again, to magnetize the builders and the creators out there that are really seeing clearly. See clearly of what's possible here. It can be so much brighter, better, impactful, profound if we just, again, release ourselves from the frameworks of the past and really step into what we know now. It's like operating from old science. It's like let's operate from the updated science of how all of this can work more seamlessly.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And it's in a weird way, like we kind of need to go back pre-industrial to take principles of learning from that
Yep.
to come
Yeah.
back to the 21st century and apply it in obviously an industrialized society. And I think that's and I agree with you. The regenerative space will have to win out because there is no other alternative. Otherwise,
Yeah. Yeah.
we'll all burn
Yeah,
out.
just collapse. Yeah, it's just the poly crisis. But as our advisor Karen Rabore, who is the head of global talent at IKEA, she said it's not a poly crisis, it's a poly opportunity. Because truly, that's where it's like, oh, the poly opportunity is to apply regenerative thinking to every single piece of this pie. That you use biomimicry, you operate with the logic of life, you design from that place, and these problems will be solved. What we have to do ultimately is redefine what is truly valuable, and that has to transcend profit. And that's where we really get into, oh, those hooks are deep to get to that profit, because some people are still thinking that that has the most value. No, life, vitality, that's what has the most value, period.
Yes, and in a way, it's not an argument I like to make, but I just have to make it about the 4 day week as well. Is that actually happy, healthy people produce more, like more to the economy anyway. So if we did want to speak the language of, the economy, um, it's a failing model. The model we're currently using, you'll get more out of people, and you'll get more productivity and better performance, and you'll get a more socially cohesive society. As you said, it creates this ripple effect where a lot of the issues around public mistrust or climate crisis, all these things are being born from a society right now that feels perpetually time starved. And if we were starting from that place of building more time affluence for people and building their ability to regenerate, that will naturally feed into those other spaces. But we obviously aren't quite there at the macro level with some of those conversations. But what I did see from 4 day week trials was that when you see businesses experimenting with this, politicians get interested. So when we did the 4 day week trial, we had Bernie Sanders, we had Mark Takano, we had a senator from Maine from the Republican Party actually experimenting and bringing in bills. And that's starting the discourse at that level. And businesses are the great change makers because they get to do the proof of concept. They have the vested interests of the political system, and they naturally impact on society as well. So I think source is really interesting because you're obviously working with individuals, but you're ultimately trying to change business. And in doing so, you are impacting all parts of those pie.
Yep, we are definitely operating on the ground, but the technology scales so beautifully that when put in the hands of the right, C-suite, it can enable their whole organization to always stay in energetic integrity and ensure more favorable outcomes because of that energetic integrity. I just want to round this out by saying we talked about identity, and Craig Hamilton, who's an incredible thought leader, more in the philosophical spiritual space, but he talks about there being kind of three faces of one's consciousness, and it could be one is the ego, of course. The other is called the grounded being. It's the aspect of you that kind of never entered space and time. It's that part that you were pointing at in the brain that when left it starts to make like these connections. When you drop into the grounded being from a meditative place, all of those connections are also being made. It's not, anyway, it's very interesting to rest in the grounded being where you aren't doing, you're just being. But we have to train our systems to come back to that being state. And that's how you get sober. That's how you get off the drip, is by training the system to rest here, not reach out, not reach back, but be here. That is regenerative for this vehicle. And then the final phase that he talks about is the evolutionary impulse. And that is the aspect of you that is wanting to be born. That's the emergence. And to the degree that we can sit in kind of master control back here and understand, oh, I'm an ego, I'm in grounded being, I'm an evolutionary impulse, and you have the ability to kind of modulate between all of them because they're all necessary, even the ego. I use my ego all the time, but I just don't want it to use me, It's important. But we can't always be in the evolutionary impulse. We can't always be in the fireworks of it all. We have to come back, and we have to rest, and we have to ground, and we have to integrate, and we have to alchemize. And to the degree that we can be skillful, which is the definition of yoga, skill in action. To the degree that we can do that, then we start to really unlock our performance, as a, multidimensional being. So, any final words on that? Because the organization also has to make room for all of those aspects, the egoic aspects in orgs, the grounded being in orgs, and the evolutionary impulse, which is the innovation. So any final words when looking at it from that perspective?
Yeah. Well, I think there is a natural conditioning of people to operate in the ego space. And I mean that from both culturally, ego gets rewarded, but also generally people go into work and they don't think, and they often just do, and they do what was done in the past. And I think the ego is what's driving that state. And that's always made me very curious, because I think when I did my PhD, and before my PhD and after my PhD, that other space, what did you call it? Third space? The
evolutionary impulse.
That kind of became very activated for me during that period.
Yeah.
And now it won't shut up sometimes, which can be, I'm always thinking perhaps too forward or too visionary about stuff. And as a person then, who likes to chase that, it can be, non-linear.
It can be another addiction. It can be another addiction. Yeah.
Yes, totally. And I think that middle space is a space where I have been curious, and I've been putting language around it in the context of what I call being temporally intelligent. So, Daniel Goleman bringing in emotional intelligence back, 20 years ago. People didn't talk about emotions in the workplace, and suddenly they had a language and a framework in which they could begin to have those conversations. And I think the problem that I hear consistently from leaders and people in the context of change is that I don't have enough time. And so that is a barrier in and of itself that we need to have a deeper inquiry around. Is it that there isn't actually time, or is that time is not being designed or curated in a way that allows that middle space that you're talking about, the sitting in the being, the ability to understand what is actually happening beyond the automated, ego-driven kind of repetition that we just do in our behaviors every day. And yeah, I think that can be applied in the context of individuals gaining a sense of sovereignty over their temporality, in the context of how teams come together, and not just individuals bringing their own individual ideas, but how they might create states of group flow, and what are the conditions to create that state of group shared mental modeling. And then what is the temporal architecture that's required to allow variance in different modes of time to operate in multiple ways. So thinking about the short, medium, and long term time cadences within an organization, and allow those all to coexist in a way that's harmonious, not friction, which is often where they are at the moment. So yeah, I often think a big learning for me actually was we're all trying to say the same things. We're all just using different ways to land in the same space. And it's so liberating when you start to realize that when someone says something about something, it doesn't have to be real, but it is speaking to something real. And we're all trying to circle it, and we'll never actually get there. That's not the point. It's that we're all starting to realize that we're all saying the same thing, and we start having conversations. That's the sauce. That's the excitement. That's the really enjoyable stuff when you start feeling.
Yeah, there's nothing more exciting to me than creating, and the idea of recreating the system, for as arduous as it is, there's nothing that is more exciting, because we can do it in our own companies, we can do it in our own lives. That's called embodiment. So this isn't something that we think, this is something that we live, and it's very different just to like spout things off just intellectually. No, to live it, bring that, ground it into the tissues, into your behavior. Okay, I can do that in my own life. That's me creating. And then I get to ripple it out into my relationships. And then I get to ripple it out into the work I'm doing in the world. And, just to bring it back to the practice, where you are going to be a featured voice on our next cohort, which we are so blessed and honored to have you, and have your mind and have your spirit present to continue to weave the fabric by which, we'll travel upon together. Because you're bringing, again, a different kind of language. We're looking at the same area, but you're looking at it from a different angle. So it's so cool to be able to receive all of that into my location over here, and just holding so much open for what's possible when we can give people, at least in the practice, that 30-day experience, a place to come and be more in the isness. Isness of it, which again, it's not about us giving you your answers. It's about giving you a place so you can find your answers. And a good teacher is going to ask you questions, good questions, more than give you advice. Because what we ultimately want, I think, as individuals, is to be able to rest in our own knowing, our own soul's knowing. But a lot of times we've got to lift off all of that clutter until we get there. And that practice, the 30 days, is a container by which you can start to, kind of burn through any of the things that are no longer serving.
Yeah. And and I think what I don't know how really to put not like to try pitch it, but for a cynical fucker like me to work in this space, there is something in it, and I think what you've said is important, that you're not, the practice is there not to tell you how to do anything. It is simply just creating the shared space whereby everyone's coming with different language, different experiences, and some more cynical than others, and everyone comes away getting something very felt and seen from it. And I think that's when I think about what's making a positive impact on well-being in the world, I think it's when people feel seen, and that's not being seen for the performance that they're putting on, but for something that is deeper,
real.
Real.
Something that's real. Yeah. Well, Dale, we appreciate you so much. Thank you for the incredible work that you're doing and the heart in which you're doing it with. We are so excited to launch with you in October, and tell people how to get more of you if they want.
Yeah, I mean, LinkedIn is where I post the most. Some days I wake up with a sense of existential dread and I put up a LinkedIn post. That is the main platform I use. I kind of deleted all my other socials and just invested my time and energy into one for the moment. And find me there, Dale Whelehan.
Beautiful. Appreciate you, and more to come. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thank you.